Welcome to the WTO Trade Dialogues on Food. Welcome to our very distinguished panel. Welcome to our viewers. My name is Doa Abdelmotal. I'm Senior Counselor in the WTO Agriculture and Commodities Division, and I'm very pleased to be here with you today and to be moderating this debate. In this dialogue, I'll be putting 2 rounds of questions to our panelists, after which I will be taking questions from you, the viewers, at the following email address, dialogues@wto.org. I'd like to begin by providing some context for today's dialogue, entitled Exploring the Nutrition and International Trade Nexus, a webinar that I've been planning with Chris Hagedorn, the Secretary of the Committee on World Food Security, for a while now, and I'm very glad that we have been able to make this happen. Nutrition, together with hunger and food security, is certainly an issue that is at the top of the international agenda. However, despite the priority that all governments and international organizations are giving to the issue, the State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World Report 2021 has painted a bleak picture. The report was discussed at length at the 49th session of the Committee on World Food Security, which took place just 2 weeks ago. It indicates that the world, unfortunately, has not been progressing towards the Sustainable Development Goals of ensuring access to safe, nutritious, and sufficient food, or of eradicating all forms of malnutrition. It states that between 720 to 811 million people in the world continue to face hunger. This is about 160 million more people than in 2019. So the numbers, unfortunately, have gotten worse. Moreover, nearly 2.37 billion people do not have access to adequate food. It also indicates that no region in the world has been spared. This, unfortunately, is a problem across all regions, and it argues that the cost of healthy diets remains high, the levels of poverty remain high, income inequality is high, and all of this keeps healthy diets out of the reach of billions of people. This is a difficult reality. It's hard to talk about hunger and it's hard to visualize hunger. The report contains a number of important passages on trade policy and the role that trade can make in nutrition, whether positively or negatively. And I would encourage viewers to go through the report. To give you some flavor of what it says on trade, it gives examples, for instance, of situations where countries have reduced tariffs on healthier foods like vegetables, and have been able to promote much healthier and greener diets as a result. But it also gives examples of situations where countries have lowered tariffs on things like sugary drinks, only to find that obesity has risen. On the bright side, the Committee on World Food Security has recently adopted voluntary guidelines on food systems and nutrition. These guidelines are the world's first multilateral instrument on nutrition, and we are privileged to have Chris Hagedorn, the Secretary of that committee, with us today to discuss those guidelines with us. The guidelines call upon governments and stakeholders to take a range of actions to combat malnutrition. The voluntary guidelines recognize the important role that international trade plays in nutrition and acknowledge, I quote, that a universal, rules-based, open, non-discriminatory, and equitable multilateral trading system will contribute to achieving food security and improving nutrition. The guidelines also urge governments to pursue improved nutrition outcomes whilst abiding by the rules of the WTO. So how exactly does nutrition interact with international trade policy? This is the main question that this dialogue will revolve around. So let me, without further ado, introduce this very distinguished panel to you. Chris Hagedorn is Secretary of the Committee on World Food Security. Ambassador Sambu Antas is Ambassador of the Permanent Mission of Vanuatu to the WTO. Good morning, sir. Anne-Marie Tho is Associate Professor at the School of Public Health at the University of Sydney. Thank you, Anne, for joining us despite the time difference. Charlie Worthington is Food Specialist at Consumers International. Hello, Charlie. Rick White is Chair of the International Agri-Food Network. Good morning, sir, and thank you very much for all the cooperation between your network and the WTO and the Global Dialogue on Trade that we held in July. And Eric Wickstrom is Counselor at the Trade and Environment Division of the World Trade Organization and our resident expert on technical barriers to trade. Let me now start with the first round of questions. Anne-Marie, I'll start with you. The recently concluded United Nations Food Systems Summit has revealed that food systems are now being called upon to deliver more sustainable, but also safer and more nutritious and more affordable food. Do we have an international consensus, do you think, on what a nutritious diet is? And do you see a role for trade policy in supporting summit outcomes?
Thank you so much, Joa, for the invitation, as well as for such an excellent question. The voluntary guidelines that you mentioned earlier on food systems and nutrition do make a really clear statement about the core characteristics of a healthy diet. We do know what healthy diets look like. Core tenets include diets that are predominantly based on minimally processed, nutritious foods characterized by access to culturally appropriate foods and dietary diversity. In fact, these diets, and particularly that aspect which is minimally processed and the cultural appropriate aspects, also are often positive for environmental sustainability and well-being overall. We see these core characteristics of a healthy diet reflected in food-based dietary guidelines, which are, I would say, at heart, consistent across countries. But notably, they are not identical, and this is due to cultural considerations. I'm delighted to be presenting with my esteemed colleague from Vanuatu. And as an example, traditional, healthy and environmentally sustainable diets in the Pacific may look different to diets in other regions of the world. And I think this is a really important consideration when we do come to that interface with trade policy, and particularly in considering the need for diversity in nutrition policy responses. To go to your second question, though, about the role that trade policy plays in supporting the outcomes of the summit, I want to really emphasize, as you said, that food insecurity is on the rise. Malnutrition costs the global economy trillions of dollars due to direct healthcare costs and lost productivity. Increasingly, we're seeing dietary inequality and an exacerbation in people's access to healthy food and the differentials, particularly for low-income consumers. The voluntary guidelines do really emphasize the importance of governments adopting strong policies to enhance access to healthy, affordable, and diverse diets. So I would say unequivocally, yes, there is a role for trade. And this is really premised on the fact that the governance of food systems and thus access to these healthy, environmentally sustainable diets is inherently multi-sectoral. Trade agreements govern the movement of food internationally. They govern trade in food services. They govern trade-related investment in the food sector, the commercial intellectual property of foods. And increasingly, they also govern behind-the-border technical measures relating to nutrition. Trade can definitely contribute to access to diverse and affordable diets, improving food security. However, trade liberalisation has been associated also with nutrition transition and increased consumption of highly processed, less healthy diets. And so we do see a tension in terms of the opportunities that arise. And the opportunity in particular that I see is one for strengthened coordination and policy coherence. And as such, dialogues like this are essential, bringing together parties across the table to also understand that when trade policy makers sign agreements, they are also making food system policy. And I think recognition of that allows us to understand that while there is, of course, a responsibility of health sector policymakers to consider and comply with trade agreements, there's also a responsibility on the trade side to consider the impact of trade policy decisions on nutrition. We do need to have increased engagement across those sectors.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie, for this excellent overview. And indeed, better multilateral governance, better governance at the global level of the nutrition issue, which is multi-sectoral, as you've said. Chris, I will now come to you for further scene setting. What can you tell us about the voluntary guidelines on nutrition, how they came about, and what the main fault lines were in their negotiation? And what contribution do you think they make to better nutrition?
Thank you so much, Doa, for the invite and to be joined by this panel and this audience. So greetings from Rome in the Committee on World Food Security, or the CFS, the UN's unique, inclusive, multilateral, and science-backed platform for governments and other key actors to negotiate policy guidance on the global food system. Let me also share first the warm greetings of the new CFS chair, Gabriel Ferrero of Spain, elected on 14 October at CFS 49 with a new bureau, and let you know that he intends to visit Geneva very soon and maybe seeing some of you there. So Doa, on scene setting, the VGFSN, as we call them, the Voluntary Guidelines on Food Systems and Nutrition, beyond addressing these incredibly worrying numbers you listed from the SOFI 2021 report, they've been a work in progress since 2016, long before the Food Systems Summit, and really kind of got going with an outstanding report, number 12, of the CFS's high-level panel of experts. And I encourage those to have a look at that report. It's very comprehensive. Last year and early this year, CFS members and participants in CFS negotiated the very detailed text, and eventually the VGFSN was adopted at CFS 47 on February 10, 2021. So why are they important? This is the first time global consensus in a multilateral setting has been reached on these complex issues between food, environment, and nutrition. And it was done so by 133 member governments and other core groups of CFS. That includes civil society, private sector, UN agencies, the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, UN Nutrition, and many others. They consist of 105 recommendations grouped into 7 buckets, everything from food environments to protracted crises, even a chapter on implementation. So look, their aim is to promote effective interventions and policy coherence between key sectors like health, agriculture, education, environment, gender, social protection, trade, employment, all the sectors that have significant impacts on food systems and nutrition. The negotiations were certainly challenging on many fronts, as you asked, including definitions. What is a healthy diet? Use of agrochemicals and pesticides, human rights, marketing to children, breast milk substitutes, taxes, incentives, and of course, trade. What is remarkable is that we did reach consensus in all 7 of those areas and all 105 recommendations. It was a first. We are working now to promote their awareness prompt their uptake, and encourage their application at regional, country, and local levels, as well as global, and including within these country dialogues that have developed from the UN Food Systems Summit. So I encourage you to read the guidelines, as well as FAO's digital evidence platform, which will complement those voluntary guidelines and support our efforts to get the word out on this important product. And so thank you again for your partnership and our continued development of this conversation. Over.
Thank you very much, Chris. So you've listed a lot of the areas like trade, education, gender, and so on, agriculture, and so on, that need to be taken into account to achieve greater and better nutrition. I think this shows the magnitude of the challenge before us. It's such a cross-cutting sector. Ambassador Antas, let me come to you. First of all, thank you very much for joining us today. We were very keen to have a Pacific perspective in this webinar, in particular in light of the extent of the malnutrition in that part of the world. What can you tell us about the principal drivers of hunger and malnutrition in the Pacific? Over to you, sir. You will need to unmute your microphone.
Thank you very much for this afternoon, and thank you for the invitation to speak in this trade dialogue. I am not able to speak for the Pacific, but I will speak for Vanuatu, which probably has the same features as the other Pacific Island countries. But let me start off by saying, in terms of Vanuatu, just to give some background, that we are susceptible to natural disasters throughout 12 months of the year, from tropical cyclones to earthquakes, to volcanic eruptions, to droughts, to floods, and you name it. We are always in a perpetual state of disaster that we have to manage. So you can understand, in a situation like that, the production and the consumption of food, and good nutritious food, will always be a challenge. And because Vanuatu is classified as one of the most disaster risk countries in the world, we are always faced with issues to do with food. Even when as the question you raise is how serious, or how do we, what are the main drivers of hunger and malnutrition in the Pacific? I can say this, that as has been said earlier on by our colleagues from Australia, that traditional knowledge is very important in food production and the consumption of balanced diets. So I'll give an example. When a mother has a baby, the first thing that the Vanuatu will do, food that they will give to the mother, is this island cabbage, they call it, very rich in nutrition, in iron, vitamin A, and to increase the production of blood in the mother. Now that kind of knowledge is somehow, in some parts of Vanuatu, is being lost. So to try and replace that vitamin A and the produced blood in the mother is sometimes, in some situations, very, very concerning. Some traditional knowledge is very important for us to ensure that balanced diet, balanced food consumption, and good nutrition. There is a problem in Vanuatu in terms of now you see the access to, say, protein. There's not enough protein. And so you see people in the local communities consuming a lot of starchy food, but insufficient protein. So even though having said about traditional knowledge, but some of this knowledge is being lost. And so you see this behavior, this pattern happening again. And so you will find in some communities in Vanuatu people, children who are malnourished. A lot of children are malnourished. And this, the other thing that I have to say at this time is that there appears to be a limitation on the production of food in the local communities. So suddenly we send children to school. They're supposed to bring their lunch, and you find that some of them do not bring lunch. And why are not they bringing lunch with them? Because they have no food. The parents do not produce. And I think it's quite common not only in the Pacific, but also in some parts of the world as well. So there's a production issue also. In Vanuatu now, there is a big effort to produce local food. There is an effort to prepare food properly. There is a slow food effort happening in Vanuatu now. And we can say that, and I'm speaking mostly on the rural sector where most of our population reside. Now, in the urban setting, where people do not have access to land, there is income inequality or no income at all. We're encouraging people to do backyard gardening, but there are people who actually live in the urban areas who are quite, who go hungry. And it is unfortunate because in Vanuatu, you stick anything in the ground, it will grow. You put a banana, it will grow. A mango tree, it will grow. It will produce. But the problem in the urban area, and you see the phenomenon of migration to the urban area, is causing some of this issues related to hunger and malnutrition also. So I think that these are some of the issues that are bringing up this malnutrition and hunger. So first, the technology is there; it's being lost, and then secondly, that even after some of the knowledge on traditional knowledge, there is focus on too much starchy food and not enough on a balanced diet. But there is a lot of work being done, as has been said earlier on by two speakers, and we will discuss this later in this dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Antas. I think that was quite sobering. The loss of traditional diets. I think that's a very important theme in the nutrition issue. The fact that knowledge is being lost, the fact that certain traditions are being replaced by modern ways of growing and of consuming food. And this is part of what Anne-Marie referred to as the sort of nutritional transition that is taking place. Let me come to you, Charlie, now. I'd like to know what the position is of Consumers International on nutrition and on the role of trade policy in nutrition. What would Consumers International like to see, and how is that position determined?
Thanks so much, Doa, and for everyone's comments so far. For those who aren't familiar, Consumers International, we represent a network of over 200 consumer organizations across more than 100 countries worldwide on every continent, all of whom are engaging with consumers and their rights and needs on a day-to-day basis. So to answer your question about how our positions are determined, this is done in conversation with our members, but also by bringing in our own expertise developed from engaging with these issues at international level, a level which is not often accessible to consumer voices. As I work on nutrition specifically, it's not separate necessarily from consumer priorities on food more broadly. Nutrition is linked to food security because getting enough calories doesn't mean a whole lot if you're not being nourished as well. It's linked to food safety because truly safe food is safe not just from adulteration or contamination, but also keeps consumers healthy in the long term from non-communicable diseases. Nutrition and sustainability, again, as mentioned previously, are often two sides of the same coin. We find that the solutions that work for people often work for the planet as well. And both ultimately depend on building food systems that prioritize and enable access to fresh, healthy, largely locally produced food. This is where trade comes in, where trade has such a crucial role in taking this critical step of making healthy food accessible, available, and affordable to consumers. Trade has the potential to reshape food environments, to make nutritious and sustainable food not just one option among many, limited to those who can seek them out and afford them, but the easy option, the incentivized option for all consumers. Trade can really change the game so that consumer choice is not between good and bad options, but between good and better. In terms of what we'd like to see at Consumers International, how we think we can get there, I think the first step is for, at some level, this real rethink of how we approach trade, putting people and planet at the center, building in consumer rights and needs from the start, not just as an afterthought, and also approaching trade more holistically, again, as Anne-Marie mentioned, not just through this economic lens of trade policy, but by integrating with food policy, with health policy, with climate, to make sure these aren't pulling in opposite directions, but all working towards that same goal. Also key is this holistic approach, cooperation across borders and between stakeholders in the market to really understand trade as cooperation and not just competition. Obviously, it's a big ambition. We're not expecting to get there overnight. And while Consumers International is committed to having these conversations with all those who share these goals, we also recognize that many consumers can't wait for that top level change. And we also need these concrete next steps to make a difference as quickly as possible. These specific solutions are obviously more variable. As we just heard, they depend to a great deal on geographic and socioeconomic context and the specific actors involved. But a major part of our focus and our global network's focus is to work with key stakeholders, governments, businesses, institutions to diagnose these next steps and to co-create a plan of action. To give a couple of more specific examples, in preparation for this year's Food Systems Summit, we produced a global consumer advocacy statement on the future of food with support from our task force of members who are kind of at the forefront of this issue, which we think is a helpful starting point to understand these next steps. This statement included calls to action under a range of key themes, one of which was this point I touched on earlier about healthy and sustainable food environments. Specific kind of examples included in this, suggested by members, by consumer advocates worldwide, included setting standards for healthier foods, not just voluntary standards, but real minimum barriers, for instance, on salt, sugar, fat, saturated fat content. Another focus was on the role of national dietary guidelines, not just to inform consumers, but as a basis for all actors to work from governments, businesses, and including in shaping trade policy. Another really important element I want to highlight is on this key question of affordability of nutritious food, often a bit of an elephant in the room because it can be so difficult to address, but really a crucial piece of the puzzle in making sure that healthy and sustainable food is affordable for all and ideally also more affordable than less positive options. Action on this front, again, takes diverse forms in different contexts. It could include action on food pricing or on fiscal policy, although again, it's crucial to make sure that consumers are never priced out of access to food as a result. A straightforward but powerful solution identified in our statement is the use of consumer subsidies and cash transfers, which have really played a crucial role in mitigating the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on food security and nutrition for the most vulnerable especially. We find that strengthening consumer purchasing power not only strengthens access to food, but also boosts consumption of nutritious and sustainable food. And has to be a key priority moving forward. All of these solutions, of course, are context dependent, but I think the key takeaway is this point that consumers will eat healthy and sustainable food, follow healthy and sustainable diets, if these are accessible, available, and affordable. And trade policy is a valuable tool, maybe the most valuable tool for achieving this goal. Thanks.
Very clear messages there, Charlie, on food needing to be accessible, available, and affordable, and on international trade having a key role to play in making this happen. Thank you for that. Rick, I will now turn to you. As chair of the International Agri-Food Network and the private sector mechanism of the Committee on World Food Security, what do you believe the role of the private sector is and should be on nutrition? Should the private sector simply respond to food demand, including where demand for lower prices trumps quality and nutrition, or does it have a role to play in promoting better nutrition as well?
Thank you, Doa, and thank you for the invitation. It's a very important webinar, and it's a pleasure to be here. On your first question, in terms of the what I believe the role of the private sector should be on nutrition, I look at when you look at the voluntary guidelines on food systems and nutrition and the Sustainable Development Goals, they highlight the importance of the role of the private sector. The recommendations include strong directions for all stakeholders, including the private sector, to take an active role in promoting the recommendations in the voluntary guidelines. The wider Sustainable Development Goals and 2030 Agenda, in particular SDG 17, calls for a revitalized and enhanced global partnership that brings together governments, civil society, the private sector, the UN system, and other actors, and mobilize all available resources to achieve the SDG's ambitious targets. And what has become clear over the past years, a successful sustainable development agenda requires partnerships between governments, the private sector, and civil society. These inclusive partnerships, built upon principles and values, a shared vision, and shared goals that place people and the planet at the center, are needed at the global, regional, national, and local level. So the role of the private sector in nutrition is very multifaceted in bringing knowledge, expertise, resources, research, innovation, infrastructure, communication, coordination, and collaboration in all this, in growing, creating, and delivering not just food, but the nutrition required for healthy and balanced diets around the world. On your second question about responding to just food demand or what role in promoting better nutrition, the private sector and industry doesn't simply respond to food demand. It has an important role to play in ensuring food security and nutrition. And as chair of the private sector mechanism, I represent a wide number of businesses of all sizes throughout the agri-food value chain, and can attest to the commitment of industry to promote better nutrition. This includes commitment by farmers, which I also proudly join as a category. The private sector has provided numerous examples within the CFS space and beyond, such as with the UN Decade of Action on Nutrition, of concrete actions the sector is doing to promote better nutrition. These involve around commitments for actions, key partnerships and projects, and investment in research and innovation. So as examples, longstanding commitments have been made by industry on product formulation and innovation to improve and innovate products with the goal of making available food choices that help people eat healthy, balanced diets. Nutrition information to provide clear, fact-based nutrition information to enable consumers to make informed choices. Responsible marketing to children by extending responsible advertising and marketing initiatives to children globally. And finally, promotion of balanced diets, healthy lifestyles, and increased physical activity in the workplace and in communities around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rick. And indeed, research, innovation, infrastructure, all of that, none of that can be achieved without the help of the private sector. So clearly, the private sector is a key player in moving us towards better nutrition. Eric, I would now like to come to you. As the WTO's top expert on food standards, how have you seen nutrition issues play out in the WTO? In fact, how would you explain to our viewers that nutrition is at all an issue in WTO? And in what way does it interact with the WTO rulebook?
Thanks, Doa. Quite a few questions there. Basically, you're asking why trade, why WTO, what are the issues? And perhaps a very, very brief answer to that is that, well, people and countries have traded on food since the dawn of age, if one can put it that way. We have always somehow exchanged food, whether it's fish for meat or vegetables and so on. So more lately, governments have begun to regulate, and when you regulate, trade is affected. And when trade is affected, at sometimes it comes to the WTO because one member of the WTO or another is displeased or would like to see a change in this regulation. That's a very, very brief overview of that question. I think it was put very clearly by Charlie here that the key issue is really one of access to adequate food, affordable food, and you repeated that, Doha. And I think the key question for governments, and now I speak of governments coming from the WTO, that is often our perspective, is how you calibrate that intervention in the right way, in the most efficient and effective way. One thing I would say as the outset is that of course, health policy should be, you need health policy to address a health issue, not trade policy to address a trade issue. That's very simplistic, of course, but I think it's important to keep in mind that when governments regulate for health matters, the primacy of their objective should be one of addressing the health issue. In the same way as if you're regulating for an environmental issue, the primacy is environment. Trade is secondary in that sense. Trade rules should not get in the way, hopefully, and they should not be used as an excuse for inaction, which sometimes they are used. So that said, when governments address nutrition, and having looked at this for some time, the policy is a very, very mixed one. It's not only trade, of course, or it's not only regulating. It could be prices, it could be subsidies, etc. Regulation, and that's where we come to labeling and nutrition, is part of the mix. And that regulation will affect trade, and that's normal. It might even be very necessary that it affects trade. And that may be the whole idea about it. Usually, governments are using regulation, when you see it at the WTO, as a way of trying to avoid confusion with respect to use of which standards are being used, or as a way of providing information to consumers through labeling. And if they use different labels, that can cause an issue. But usually, I would say those are two of the main aspects of regulation in the WTO area. And it can, to get to finally to your question here, it can become an issue at the WTO. By an issue, I mean a country may raise a concern. It doesn't mean that the concern is valid, but it can be raised at the WTO. And that is often about the fact that different standards have been used to achieve that same objective, a good nutritional outcome. Or it could be that a country feels that the regulation is too restrictive, or it's not transparent, discriminatory, probably lesser order. Those are the types of issues that come up. But I would say that we are often talking about labeling here, and labeling is one of the least trade restrictive measures the government can take. It does affect trade, but the question is if it's really going to cause a problem. I think I'll leave it at that for the moment. Thanks, Dora.
Thank you very much, Eric. And indeed, many takeaways in your statement there. We need health policy to address health issues, environmental policy to address environmental issues, and trade is secondary in that regard, must not get in the way, but of course it still has a role to play. Thank you for that. Let me now move to the second round of questions. Of course, a lot of questions have already come in from viewers on the various answers that you've given, but I will save that for the Q&A at the end. So, Chris, let me start with you in the second round. Can you give us an overview of the discussions that took place during the negotiations of the voluntary guidelines on trade, and how you expect trade policy to contribute to better nutrition?
Well, thanks, Doha. Yeah, trade, as I said earlier, was certainly one of the many elements that is addressed in the VGFSN, and as it typically is in CFS, was amongst the sensitive topics where many divergent views were expressed. We read WTO's and FAO's and others' research papers on trade and food security. Hence, we know trade has both positive and negative dimensions. It clearly has a potential to increase availability of diverse foods, thereby contributing to improved dietary diversity, dietary quality, and reductions in undernutrition. At the same time, increases in relative availability and affordability of highly processed, less nutritious foods via trade liberalization contributes to nutritional inequalities and increased prevalence of overweight, obesity, and diet-associated illnesses and disease. So there are also concerns for smallholder producers, often unable to afford healthy diets, 3 billion associated with the SOFI 2021 report, but also struggling with the clear power imbalances in food supply chains, who are particularly vulnerable to global commodity price fluctuations, especially where those smallhold food producers have limited storage options or perhaps limited economic agency over the price setting for for their own production. So the VGFSN calls for governments to improve availability and access to safe and nutritious foods that contribute to healthy diets through sustainable food systems, including via trade that should be in accordance, as you noted, with a universal rules-based, open, non-discriminatory, and equitable multilateral trading system under WTO rules. And it specifies that the VGFSN must be applied consistent with relevant international multilateral trade instruments, including WTO agreements such as Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement, or TBT, and WTO's agreement on the application of sanitary and phytosanitary measures. So we understand very well this is an extremely complex topic, very politically charged, but we're certainly watching and reading your work closely to see how these issues will be addressed at WTO. And we remain grateful for the opportunity for the conversation. Our inclusive platform of CFS will remain open for you to share those results and for us to stay connected on our work on food security and nutrition to achieve the SDG 2 and other related goals. Thanks, Doa.
Thank you, Chris, for walking us through some of the references to trade in the guidelines and the call for compatibility between the guidelines and WTO rules. Ambassador Antas, I'd like to come back to you, if I may. How do you see the role of trade policy and trade policy intersect with nutrition in the Pacific and in Vanuatu? And can trade policy contribute to better nutrition in your view?
Thank you very much for the question. I think the question can be answered with the two-pronged response. One is that there's a trade policy. Where does the trade policy not interact with nutrition? And the other part is, how do we trade policy interacts with that? So, I think in terms of the question that you raised, is that, in my view, I have seen that trade, not necessarily trade policy, it's a health policy, is the one that is driving what trade should react to what the health policies are. For example, in terms of food that is has high content in harmful substances, or food labeling that does not exist, we want to ensure that it does exist. And once those rules are out, then the trade policy framework tries to address those matters as much as possible. What I can say about the Pacific and also in Vanuatu, for example, there is a very, very high prevalence of non-communicable disease. That has arisen out, in my view, purely from the change of diet that the Nivan people have now going through, eating lots of imported products, not caring about what is in the imported products, don't have the time to look at the labeling, look at what the nutrient contents are inside. So it is something that we try as much as possible to, for example, impose import duties for example, in the agriculture sector, to try and to try and encourage the local production of fresh foods, and the fresh food that is available and is not only available but affordable to everyone in the community. So we sometimes the trade policy also tries to address the issue of domestic production, that well, introduce import duties, raise some issues related to food production, so that you increase the production of these kinds of food in the community. So we are seeing also the import duty rates on foods that are being imported, low duty rates on those goods that are healthy, mostly, as has been said earlier, not totally processed, but maybe semi-processed. There's high duty rates on those products that we think we should not encourage. Processed foods, an example given earlier on about fishy drinks, for example. But even while we impose a high duty rate, and you realize that the companies actually try to then produce those things in the domestic market. So you would try to prevent that from being imported, and you see people actually producing it in the domestic market. So there is issues of addressing it through, for example, excise taxes and so on. In terms of nutrition, for example, I've seen on the fortified food, iron fortified food, where iron is added onto salt, onto rice, onto flour, to try and address the issue of iron deficiency. So you see that there is specific identification of this kind of fortified foods, which we are promoting as much as possible to ensure that when you import foods that are fortified, the duties are much lower, and those that are not fortified, the duties are much higher. And I think one of the things I have to raise is also on the issue of food labeling. As I said, never other people, even people coming here to live in Switzerland, is that a lot of people don't really care what is on the food labeling. They don't really care what's inside the food. So there needs to be some education. And in terms of trade policy, there are lots of building blocks that must make up the entire trade policy per se. So, for example, the health policies, the energy policies, the environmental policies, these are the ones that we bring into the trade, the implementation of a trade framework. So thank you for the comments about the consumer organization. In Vanuatu, we talked about the consumer organization for many years, and we still don't have one. But we know in trade issues, that is a very important part of that element of trade, that you have to have a consumer organization that will help consumers with that kind of education. Finally, I want to say something about food supplies after natural disasters, because I have mentioned that we are always going through natural disaster. What we are seeing is that after a natural disaster, such as a cyclone, the government, to address the food issues, immediate food issues, we realize that we are buying a lot of imported foods. People are supplying foods to us, and we are making every effort to ensure that, in fact, after a disaster in Vanuatu, Vanuatu must be able to feed itself. Other parts of Vanuatu must feed those who are undergoing this natural disaster. So we understand this programs available in the multilateral area where they support the supplies of foods to disaster-prone areas, but we are always saying that please consider the local production of food, because this is our security. And when we want to make sure that a part of Vanuatu, the northern part, can supply food that is to the southern part where it has been affected by a disaster. So last week, for example, we had a volcanic eruption and the community will have lost a lot of food. So I'm sitting here and looking at what is the government going to respond to? How do they respond to that particular crisis? So that's something that I keep coming back to the natural disaster aspect of Vanuatu, because the food security and the trade policy that intersect with this with nutrition to ensure that people are eating healthy, that we eat the fresh fish. Do not you can import fish, but eat fresh fish that is available in the markets, or go and catch the fish yourself. Eat fresh vegetables, which you can buy in the market or you can grow yourself. But as has been said, good nutrition sometimes is not affordable to those, particularly those who live in the urban area. So they have issues of nutrition is always. So we have the trade policy. Of course, it has to intersect with the nutrition aspects, ensuring that our health is good all the time. And finally, to say again that the NCDs in Vanuatu and the Pacific incident is very high. So the threat, it was addressed by leaders some time ago, the Pacific leaders, that it is a catastrophe happening in our countries. So nutrition and food supplies and trade all have to work together to ensure that people are safe, people are healthy, children are well fed, mothers are healthy, and everybody in the community is living a good life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, in particular for drawing the link between bad diets and non-communicable diseases. And this is why we must pay attention to our diet, and also for stressing how natural calamities complicate the planning of food and in the process of ensuring food security in your country. So thank you very much for these comments. Rick, I will now come back to you. From a private sector perspective, what trade policy measures could lead to better nutrition outcomes? What measures would the private sector like to see more of, and what measures would it like to see less of? Any specific examples would be welcome.
Thank you. On the first question, as WTO Director General, Dr. Ngozi has said on many occasions, international trade is vital for global food security, as trade is necessary to move food from parts of our planet that have a food surplus to the parts that have a food deficit. The positive potential of trade should be discussed more in detail, and the efforts such as these WTO CFS dialogues that we're on right now to bring different stakeholders together is commendable. The correction and prevention of trade restrictions and distortions in world agricultural markets, including through the elimination of all forms of agricultural export subsidies and export measures with similar effects, is a key target of Sustainable Development Goal 2 of the 2030 Agenda. Our members were eager to share this message during the Food Systems Summit process because of the importance of trade and its transformative role in achieving zero hunger. And with the support of WTO and efforts of governments, agricultural markets remained open and trade flows were smooth, reflecting a remarkable resilience of the agricultural community market, despite the disruptions and threats such as COVID-19. We need strengthened international cooperation to harness the potential of international agricultural trade for sustainable food systems, and this requires resilient trade ecosystems that are critical to successful food systems. On your second question about what we'd like to see more or less of from a private sector perspective and some examples of that, resilient trade ecosystems result when trade built on symbiotic relationships across global value chains link with local and regional supply chains and connect farmers to domestic markets and ultimately the world. Effective responsiveness to change has been very evident as the world response to the COVID-19 pandemic. There have been many difficulties, but building on symbiotic relationships across global value chains, link with local and regional supply chains, and connect farmers to domestic markets and ultimately the world, they provide essential agricultural products where they're needed. This system of trade will help to achieve global food security, and minimizing trade distortive measures allows consumers global access to food and feed and supports farmers' ability to withstand external shocks and vulnerabilities. This is a core food system principle. As for specific examples, our recommendations would be to take practical action to reduce barriers to cross-border trade by providing tangible support to innovation by WTO recognized safety and healthy standards, such as Codex, OIE, IPPC, and related efforts to facilitate trade. This would help support the IPPC in deploying the IPPC e-Phyto solution to provide for a digitized management of electronic phytosanitary certificates, for example. Another example is providing greater support and resourcing for the work of Codex Alimentarius in setting international standards on MRLs to ensure that food is safe, and it helps in the facilitation of trade as well. Because missing MRLs or unilateral action on setting import tolerances disproportionately impacts small farmers, potentially cutting them off from international markets if the crop they are growing suddenly no longer meets the importing country's requirements. And finally, we need to enhance public and private frameworks to embed sustainability into the trade ecosystem. One such measure is increasing financial support and incentives to aid SMEs in aligning their operations with the goals of the Paris Agreement to reduce Scope 3 emissions in the supply chains of multinational entities and achieve national determined contributions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Rick. Indeed, resilient trade and a resilient international trading system is vital for the private sector and for global food security. So these things go hand in hand. And we have learned from the COVID crisis that we need to protect global value chains. And you've now added that global value chains can't function without a proper local supply chain and without the farmers. So thank you for those comments. Anne-Marie, let me come to you. I'd like you to take us to the issue of nutrition labeling more specifically. To what extent are nutrition product and restaurant labels helpful? Nutri-Score, a particular label, often comes up in discussions on food labeling.
Thank you, Doa. Nutri-Score is an excellent example of rising government interest globally in interpretive front of pack labels. These labels use colours and symbols to improve consumer understanding of the relative healthiness of different foods. You know, as a bit of background, there's long been Codex guidance on the technical and detailed back of pack labels, which detail the nutritional composition of food. And these are very important for transparency. However, they don't help consumers to make healthy choices. And this is very understandable. Over 20,000 new food products launch every year, and the practice of home food cooking is declining. As a result, people are not always aware of what is in their food and what the implications of that is for their health. As Ambassador Antas pointed out, people are not always, people without a detailed nutrition knowledge or a degree in nutrition struggle to understand what the implications are of the food that they eat. And with rising rates of non-communicable disease globally, this is a really important issue for governments to address. In terms of your question about, I guess, whether they're helpful, I would argue that they are incredibly helpful, but I want to really highlight that labeling needs to be contextually appropriate. So, for example, what provides helpful information to consumers in Australia, such as our health star rating system that we use, may be different to what helps consumers in France, where Nutri-Score was developed. And this may again be different to what's helpful for consumers and their understanding in Chile and other Latin American countries where warning labels are preferred. Overall, we do see clear scientific evidence that front of pack interpretive labels do draw consumer attention, prompt them to consider health and nutrition in their grocery shopping and influence their purchasing patterns. And this, as I said, holds true for different forms of labeling, which have been developed in context-specific ways. I will flag, though, in terms of the trade interface, that specific trade concerns, as Eric has already mentioned, have been raised about mandatory labelling initiatives. And I also wanted to highlight that following, I think, Charlie's comments, one of the challenges here is that nutrition policy does involve regulation that impacts directly on the food industry. So not only labelling, but also restrictions on marketing, which were brought up earlier, fiscal policy interventions, etc. And so I also see labelling in this context as really highlighting the dual responsibility and the need for engagement between trade and health. It's very important that labelling initiatives are compliant with trade agreements, that they do, as Eric pointed out very eloquently, focus and are designed to achieve a health impact appropriate to the labelling. It's also important that they're evidence-based and made in transparent ways. However, there is a responsibility on the trade side to ensure policy space for these evidence-based interventions. Particularly, I'd highlight the need for policy space for governments to manage conflicts of interest in the policy-making process and to be able to manage stakeholder engagement in ways that bring stakeholders in at appropriate points. The need to balance the important issue of harmonisation to facilitate trade with context-appropriate nutrition policy interventions, because occasionally those can be in tension. Finally, the need to recognise evidence relevant to nutrition policy. And I think the voluntary guidelines on food systems and nutrition provide a really clear global statement of the evidence base. They also, and the resulting policy recommendations, but they also highlight the need to recognise traditional, Indigenous and other forms of local evidence, which are essential to inform robust nutrition policy. So I do want to echo the remarks that my fellow panelists have made about the need for that constructive, mutually beneficial engagement between trade and health sectors to support evidence-based health policies to ensure equitable access to nutritious food. And as Eric put it, to ensure that trade doesn't get in the way and is able to enable and support that policy space.
Thank you, Anne-Marie, for that. And I really, I found your comment very thought-provoking, interesting, and spot on, that within the policy space that governments have, they must manage conflicting interests. And that's, that's a very delicate issue for governments when they're pulled in different directions based on different and probably equally valid, sometimes equally valid objectives. And this is the challenge in the area of nutrition because it is so multi-sectoral. So, Eric, let me come to you. And I think in the wake of the intervention from Anne-Marie, this question will make even more sense. Product labeling is a big theme in the WTO Committee on Technical Barriers to Trade. What rules must nutrition labels comply with in the WTO, and have any specific nutrition labels received attention?
Thank you, Doa, again. On the rules, I think I would emphasize harmonization as a very important one, and it links to what many others have spoken about. I mean, essentially, these rules say that when governments regulate, they should base their regulation, including nutrition labeling, on international standards. That seems simple, but there's a whole complex world behind, because that puts a lot of emphasis on the standards, because the WTO is essentially contracting out this to standards bodies. And I don't think that is always so appreciated. And the fact that, that if you do not have international standards that are obvious in this area, this will create fragmentation, which then goes down to business. And I think Rick said something about this too, on the importance of international standards. So I would emphasize the importance of the development of international standards in this area, because the rules of the WTO say that regulation should be based on such standards. Of course, governments can regulate without basing themselves on standards, but they run a higher risk of being challenged successfully at the WTO. Of course, that's one rule. We don't have time to go through them, all of them, but one maybe I would also, as a backdrop, say that we're talking about a legitimate policy objective, which is of the highest importance here. I think you made the point at the outset, Doa, that poverty and income inequality is keeping healthy diets out of reach from around 3 billion people around the world. I think this comes from your report, Chris, in this area. So there's no issue about the importance of the objective. It's how it is implemented in practice. And as Anne-Marie repeated too, that if the governments regulate and use nutritional labeling based on international standards in a way that at least to some degree contributes to achieving that objective, who can strike that down? Who's going to bring that down? I don't think that is even an issue at the WTO, but it's a big if, of course, but I'm trying to make the point simpler than what it is. So I think in this case, because we're talking about labeling, it's not a ban, it's not prohibitive, it's something that allows trade, it's about information. I don't see, and I'm going out a bit on a limb here, as trade rules as being the big issue in the picture. Having said that, people will say, well, how about the TBT committee? And of course, labeling has come up very much in the TBT committee. We have our meeting next week. There are new measures on nutritional labeling that are there, that are on the agenda, that will be discussed next week. But the types of issues will be what I'm talking about now: trade restrictiveness, what are the international standards, etc. And a small final point, I know you want to go to the discussion, but I think raising these issues at the WTO is also positive. It promotes this understanding of the importance of international standard. There is a learning aspect to it because governments see how other members have done it and appreciate that, well, if Chile could do this on nutritional labeling, well, I can do it like this, or maybe even better. And it also shows the evidence and the scientific basis for this regulation, how important that is. That's not only something that comes in international standards, but is evident in the discussions at the WTO. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Eric, and thank you for your emphasis on harmonization, but for also sharing with us the reality that there is, as you put it, a whole world behind that term, how you build an international standard and how long it takes for the world to get there. Charlie, let me now come to you for the final question in the second round before we open this up to viewers. How does Consumer International view nutrition labeling? And what are Consumer International's views on the potential for misleading consumer information?
Thanks so much, Doa. Yeah, I mean, first of all, we find ourselves having this conversation about nutrition labeling a lot. And obviously, it's a key priority for us. This right to information is such an important part of the consumer advocacy focus. But as others have mentioned, I think it's important to start with that caveat that improving labeling alone is not going to be enough to deliver the kind of scale of global dietary change in nutrition and sustainability that we really urgently need. One of the difficulties of finding a solution associated with the kind of well-documented difficulties of sharing labels on nutrition, but also sustainability, safety, recyclability. There's this real risk of overloading consumers. And as we say, it becomes very hard to have a clear impact in this space. We find there's a real risk that this focus on labeling to the exclusion of other topics risks trying to pass the burden of nutrition onto consumers and onto this kind of process of researching and finding, often paying a premium for more nutritious, more sustainable options, when in practice, these changes should be made kind of far earlier in the value chain. The options available to consumers should all be of a standard that we don't need to be worrying about the kind of choices that are being made on that level. All of the choices should meet these requirements of health, of sustainability that consumers have a right to. That being said, there is a growing number of consumers who do have the means, be that the time, the knowledge, the money to seek out these healthier options, who will benefit from these improved standards on labeling, and it needs to be addressed. But I think the real impact of reaching a solution on nutrition labeling will only fully be unlocked once a much larger proportion of the global population has reached this point where information is the final hurdle that they face, rather than affordability, availability, accessibility, these key points that we've raised. We'd like to take an optimistic view of consumers. We think that if people can afford it and can access it, they will generally eat more healthier. I think the point you raised about misinformation is arguably more immediately impactful for the consumer experience. Certainly is linked to food environments, even for consumers who don't have the means to read through all this information. Their decisions are strongly shaped by whether it's misleading claims about health washing, greenwashing, or kind of unregulated marketing, especially to vulnerable consumers and to children. This has a really tangible impact on consumer experiences. And in terms of trade policy priorities, is a much easier fix than this really complicated question of labeling. So in terms of Consumers International's position, we obviously need to reach, as we say, contextual, locally appropriate solutions for labeling, but it's important that misinformation isn't excluded from this conversation as a result, and that we don't shift the burden of nutritious choices entirely onto consumers without addressing these kind of manifold challenges and barriers in the marketplace as it currently exists. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Charlie. Obviously, a very difficult task to protect consumers and to provide them with the information that is immediately relevant to them and that can inform a purchasing decision. I'll now open the floor to questions and answers. We already have many different questions, so I'll start sort of choosing from amongst the ones that came in first. Chris, I'll start with you, and this is a complex but fascinating question from a viewer on the tension between sustainability and nutrition in food. So the viewer is saying this: he was in a supermarket just a while ago, faced with a chocolate that had two labels on it. One, a nutrition label that gave the chocolate a very poor score, and a sustainability label that gave the chocolate a very high score because the cocoa was sourced apparently based on fair trade principles and so on. So what is a consumer to do when faced with that bar of chocolate at a supermarket? And did you face that tension in the voluntary guidelines, he says?
Thanks to the viewer who asked that question. It reminds me of pretty much every single day of my life when I go to the grocery store and try to choose foods. And I think it boils down to something I'd been thinking, maybe Charlie's comments sparked this, but it's something I've been dealing with my whole life, which is nutrition literacy is vital. The level of education around the world where labels exist, frankly, and that's not everywhere, but nutrition literacy is appallingly low worldwide. And it starts with our medical professionals, who in many countries are purposefully, by design, kept from really focusing on nutrition and the impacts of human health. Why is it important? Is because governments, it's the business case. The amount of money governments are spending to treat diabetes, cancers, and the human impacts and suffering that goes along with the NCDs created by unhealthy diets is expensive, and it's bankrupting governments in many places of the world. So, food security used to be just about calories and quantities to get enough food produced to save the starving people in whatever country. Now it's about a much more sophisticated conversation about malnutrition in all its forms and the impacts that food growing has on the environment, on biodiversity, and carbon and climate change. So, whoever asked that question, bravo to you. Keep reading, educating yourself, your family, your community, and your government officials. Strengthen the education. I don't have the right answer for you, but you have to understand that nutrition label and what the trade-offs are between the amount of sugar, carbohydrates that you're consuming in that bar of chocolate versus what the environmental impact of, and pick your pick the issue you want to focus on. There are options for you to either focus on very sustainable production or very healthy, low sugar chocolate. So I don't know if that satisfies you, but it's a complex issue. So focus on education, all of us, I think, is a place to start.
Thank you, Chris. Anne-Marie, an equally fascinating question for you from a viewer in Asia who is picking up on your concept of a nutrition transition. He is saying that he used to breakfast with fish and rice and soup, and that he now breakfasts with a coffee and a croissant. And he is asking you whether we need to guide the nutritional transition. And he knows he's not alone in having shifted diets.
Thank you, Joanne. Thank you for the interesting question. I feel that you've encapsulated some of the tensions and the trends with your description of your breakfast. So thank you for sharing that. I would come back, I think, partly to Chris's comment about nutrition literacy, but I think the issue described is deeper than, it's multifaceted. One of the things I find fascinating about nutrition is that we don't eat simply to fuel our bodies. Nutrition is and the food that we choose to consume reflects complex cultural, psychosocial dynamics at play. I think that the renewed interest in traditional diets and the belated recognition of how healthy many traditional diets are is long overdue. One of the most, I think, impactful policy interventions to improve nutrition that I've read about in relation to addressing the nutrition transition is, in fact, the government of Korea quite early on, I think about 20 years ago, decided that they would create a real cultural celebration of traditional Korean diets, which are very healthy. I've also seen this with colleagues in the Pacific. So a lot of work has been undertaken in the Pacific to do a very similar celebration of healthy traditional diets, because these foods are often, because they're locally grown, environmentally sustainable. But I think this, one of the key aspects of combating the nutrition transition is also potentially investment in traditional foods such that they become as convenient and as accessible as the more processed, more readily available, potentially less healthy food. I mean, I also want to emphasize there's nothing wrong with a croissant, but I think in the context of an overall diet, we do need to be thinking about nutritional value and ways that we can increase our consumption of fresh, minimally processed food.
Ambassador Antas, a question for you from a viewer who is picking up on your comment about the loss of traditional diets and the loss of traditional knowledge in food. And the viewer is asking whether that loss is a result of consumers making different choices, wanting to modernize their diets, whether it's a sort of a conscious choice by the consumer, or whether, in your opinion, it's the outcome of globalization and of imported food and imported traditions having crushed local traditions.
Well, obviously, it has to do with this globalization and the imports of food. So I'll give an example where if there is a birthday now, people who have access to income and they can buy flour and get eggs and sugar, and so they prepare this cake and put candles, and everybody blows candles. But the birthday person gets to blow his or her candles. And it's quite interesting that I'm seeing in Vanuatu now where people are actually doing things differently. Instead of baking a cake, they actually produce a local food and they add candles to it, which I found quite fascinating. So this globalization is actually forcing And there seems to be an idea that, if you move with the times, then you are being modern, you are doing the good stuff and so on, when that is not at all the case. So, I always, when we have this discussion, I remember, sorry if there are Muslims in this discussions, but Jesus, when he fed thousands of people with just a few loaves of bread and a few fish, and I was thinking that is a very unbalanced diet. No nutrition is clearly something's wrong with that. So obviously, some of the diet like that is continues to this day. But people think maybe I should put some bit of spices in there to make them taste better. Add a bit of salt here, and whatever it is on the and prepare food in a different format. And I see a lot of people wanting to think, oh, we have to move with the times, with the global trends. And of course, croissants is not bad either, but we should not think that they're part of a global trends that we're doing now. So I still have my breakfast of mangoes and pawpaw and so on in Geneva. It's quite expensive, but I still do that even now, because I feel as if having bread and having a toast is quite contrary to my lifestyle, because that's not how I grew up. I grew up eating local foods, and definitely bread is not part of that. So you see, even some communities actually preparing for breakfast. There'll be a bakery in the local community. We never used to have that. We should just eat bananas and yams or taro and some greens, whatever to go with it, and eat fruits and vegetables as part of the diet. So unfortunately, that's the situation because of the global trends, and people want to live with the times, but not realizing that if you come to Switzerland or to Glasgow, where I am speaking from right now, it is a totally different. People have a different sense of what they should and should not be eating.
Thank you very much for that. Charlie, a question for you from a viewer who is saying the following. Many producers lobby to close markets and to limit international trade. They lobby for protectionism. This viewer has now heard from you on this webinar that international trade can actually enhance nutrition by increasing consumer choice. And she's asking whether consumer organizations need to be as vocal in trade policy as producer organizations that have historically been much more vocal, and what can be done about that so consumers are more heard in international trade negotiations?
Absolutely, obviously that's a key priority for us as well. I think part of the issue we found certainly in this year, the Food Systems Summit, so much focus on food. The challenge that so many consumer advocates face is we work across so many issues. Food is one of them, but it spans kind of all manner of sustainable consumption, consumer protection across all kinds of marketplaces. And so, first of all, consumer advocacy is often stretched in different directions. When it comes to that vocal ability on the international stage, much of that is also about there is much less of a platform for consumer advocates to navigate what is often a very complex conversation on this. I think a lot of these positions, and obviously there's no one single position on these issues that all of our members across the world will take. In some markets, there is a strong need for more local food systems, for instance, and better connections between kind of producers and consumers at this local level is something we've been interested to work on. As part of preparation for the summit, we ran a series of dialogues in partnership with the World Farmers Organization, bringing together consumer advocates and farmer advocates to have these conversations. We didn't agree on everything, of course, but there were areas in which we were aligned and in which it could be valuable to really amplify those voices that are both not always heard as much as they should be. In other contexts, we find that this need for international trade and improving consumer choice is also of huge benefit to consumers. I think that's another part of the challenge in this question of making consumer voices heard, is that difficulty of having a single solution to platform and champion at this global level. I think more our ethos and our approach is more about incorporating consumer rights and consumer needs at every stage of this decision-making process, so that every individual decision includes these, rather than kind of issuing set approaches to apply in every context, regardless of thinking through the ramifications for consumers, for producers, for all actors in the marketplace at risk of marginalization.
Thank you, Charlie, for that. Rick, let me come to you. A question from India, and I'd like to thank the viewer for being with us despite the time difference. They are asking about supermarket chains and globalization and the power of retail, and how big supermarkets can sometimes move into countries and crush the small producers and the local producers. And so they want to know your opinion as the private sector representative on this webinar on how we should be managing this process.
That's a great question and observation. I mean, it's a challenging one. Yeah, like, you know, with globalization comes security of ongoing nutrition supplies going into all areas of the world. And this global trade is not intended, nor like, you know, it's not set up to replace local production. There needs to be, I think, room for both. There is room for both, and one should not come at the expense of the other. So when it comes to supermarkets versus local production and small production in areas, I guess at the end of the day, it ends up being a consumer choice driven by, I guess, options, availability, and prices are probably driving that as well to a large degree. So I think I'm an advocate of consumers having clear choices in the marketplace. I think that's fair. But at the same time, if you know, conglomerates are taking out local markets or local market gardens or whatever the case may be, production. I think consumers need to look at that and observe that and make their choice as to whether, you know, dealing with a large grocery chain versus a small independent local. Consumers can pick and can do their best to support both, I believe. And but again, it all depends on the individual circumstances, their ability to pay, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't really have a very clear answer other than I think consumers need to be aware of that, and consumers need to make their choices, and the end result will be what the consumer chooses at the end of the day. But all that to say is options are good in my view, and because obviously consumers are getting value from one segment or the other, I think the ideal would be consumers to recognize the value of both and shop at both and buy their food from both to spread their business around. I really don't have a very good answer for that, though.
Thank you. I thought it was quite a good answer. So Eric, quite a complicated question for you from a viewer who is saying they were very interested in your response to why the WTO is active on the issue of nutrition, but they are saying, does the WTO have expertise in this subject matter? And in the event of a conflict between nutrition and trade rules, how would the WTO generate the necessary expertise, and what role would the voluntary guidelines that we've just discussed play in the WTO's assessment of a nutrition dispute?
Okay, thanks. I don't know whether I should say thanks to that question. It's a complex one. I mean, at the WTO, our area of expertise is, of course, on trade. I've worked on TBT issues many years. SPS, I don't have any particular, I have no expertise on nutrition. And there's where we would look to, for instance, Anne-Marie is with us there. So when an issue that comes up that becomes a trade concern at the WTO, and if it even goes to dispute settlement at the WTO, what can happen sometimes is that expertise is brought in from outside to advise the panel. So a panel is a formal dispute settlement mechanism within the WTO. There you will have 3 people that are chosen between the members, and that panel can choose to seek expertise from outside. And that has happened in many of the cases that have revolved around health issues, including on food standards. So I think that's a quick answer to that question. I hope I got it.
And would there be any role, Eric, for the voluntary guidelines in the WTO?
Yeah, I think any guidance that is developed between countries is of value. I think that is, it's strange because the way WTO is set up, you have one agreement which is on food safety, animal and plant life and health. We call it SPS agreement. The text of that agreement actually specifically refers to the Codex Alimentarius Commission for food safety, OIE for animal health, and IPPC for plant health. The other agreement, the technical barriers to trade, which is more relevant to nutrition, talks about relevant international standards, but doesn't define it. To me, that leaves it open. So I think any guidance that is developed at the international level, with as many countries involved as possible, that is open, and that follows the 6 principles developed by the committee on what is a relevant international standardized model. That guidance may very well be relevant. It may not be called a relevant international body, but that doesn't really matter. It could be factual background that any panel would look at, and that probably, in the case of a dispute, some members would refer to. So definitely, I would say it is relevant factual background for any discussion here.
Thank you, Eric. I see that Chris wants the floor. Chris, over to you.
I want to know if I can ask some questions as well, because I have 2 of them, one for Eric and one for Charlie. At the WTO, we work very closely with UN Nutrition. You've identified third-party standards bodies as being your go-to source for technical info. Is there, I assume the WTO Secretariat does not staff expert nutritionists to be at the table for these discussions. So how do you deal with that? Is it through UN Nutrition? The second question for Charlie and for everyone really is the CFS produces policy recommendations and guidance that are voluntary in nature. So once they've been negotiated, once they have been put into public as the global consensus on certain issues, then it's up to really our family members, the UN agencies, and our friends to really push them out, and country governments to adopt them as appropriate. So I wanted to ask Charlie, you have 200 organizations in your network. Everything you've spoken about is touched upon in the VGFSN, but yet you've not identified or spoken about the VGFSN at all. How are you going to help promote them and work with us to get them out to your networks?
So I will give the floor to Eric and then Charlie. Eric, over to you.
Thank you, Chris. It's a somewhat similar question, I think, to what was before. I mean, again, I would make the point that, trade, because it's a horizontal issue. It will cover any type of issue that we may be looking at the composition of textiles in one case. The other one is tobacco, alcohol labeling, nutrition. So of course, we do not have staff experts in all these areas, or I work for the Trade and Environment Division, and a lot that is going on now is about carbon taxes, etc. But we're very few. Our competence is on trade issues. So what happens is that the WTO is used as a forum where these issues, when a trade problem arises, are debated. And a lot of the science comes out there. But what is important then is the participation of these organizations in multilateral environmental agreements, but on health, the international standards bodies, as observers in the TBT committee have an important role to play, to speak there. And if it does go to dispute settlement, then the panel, not the WTO staff, but the panel who is chosen by the parties may choose to seek advice externally, and they have done so. So I think that is about, I think I've answered your question on that point, but do come back if not.
Charlie, over to you.
Yeah, of course, about the implementation and question of implementing these voluntary guidelines and ensuring that consumer advocates around the world in these national contexts are able to use these tools. Certainly they're hugely valuable, as I say, given the range of issues that consumer advocates work over. Voluntary guidelines along these lines from CFS, similarly from FAO and the World Health Organization are hugely valued as a way of, as a tool to bring to governments, as an advocacy, to support consumer advocacy. The challenge, on the other hand, of course, especially this year and the last 2 years above all, is prioritizing what issues consumer advocates are able to focus on. At this international level, Consumers International, we've learned a huge amount from these voluntary guidelines and absolutely apply them into our learning and try and communicate these ideas when we are working with members to build our positions and to share knowledge on best practices. The difficulty in practice is that for many organizations around the world, the means to firstly to reach governments at all, to have their voices heard, is the first barrier that needs to be overcome. What tools and advocacy priorities they're able to bring once they're there is often a secondary concern versus being heard at all. In terms of how we go about sharing these, we speak to members kind of frequently. We have calls both building connections between members and kind of influential national and international organizations and advocacy groups working on these. And we promote knowledge sharing between members, which is hugely valuable, again, in identifying these, because obviously there's so many of these kind of policy frameworks and ideas and voluntary standards for kind of consumer advocates to be learning from. That's a key, that international learning is a key way of promoting these findings. In terms of how to keep going about that moving forward, I think as the point you raised, Chris, about turning these voluntary guidelines into practical enforceable standards lies at the national level. And that's the big priority for consumer organizations. But as we all recognize, it's easier said than done. And that's an ongoing struggle for sure.
Thank you very much for that. So with this, I'd like to bring this webinar to a close. I think it's been extremely informative. I'd like to thank Chris for the collaboration of the CFS and putting this together. And I would like to thank all the speakers for their unique perspectives. I think it's been an incredible learning experience for me, and I hope for you too, and for the viewers. We will stay in touch on nutrition issues. This will not be the last dialogue or the last word on what is a very complex subject. Thank you very much to you all, and thank you to everybody at WTO behind the scenes who puts these dialogues together. Goodbye. Goodbye.